to do some good thinking and share some good ideas today. And I warn you that it's my expectation that I'm going to get more out of you than you're going to get out of me today. So really what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a little bit to begin with about the reading I did in Fisher and use that to kind of set up a conversation which is completely unscripted but prepared, but sort of a template for us to engage together in some conversation. So I kind of worked through and took pretty notes and then tried to condense a little bit of what I got out of Thomas Fisher's, the chapters I read in this book, In the Scheme of Things, which has a nice subtitle too. When I got to about the third chapter that I read in the book, he referred to his grandfather, and I just figured he must be from the Fisher family. I still can't tell. But he said his grandfather was a Bauhaus architect who's, in a sense, like disconnect from the social world, served as a lesson to him of the kind of architect he didn't want to be. You know how family works. We are now. So having grown up in Detroit in the 50s and 60s, when public transportation was still available to young kids who wanted to skip school and go downtown in the middle of the day, I already saw the kind of destruction and abandonment of a lot of buildings and neighborhoods in Detroit, and it was an enigma to me even then, and it's now sort of an area of scholarship and reflection, particularly as we try to think and forward and imagine a new built environment that will be more sustainable, both for humans and for the earth. So that, I don't know who, for you, but for everybody for sure, you've encountered some way of organizing thinking that abstracts from the particular. And most of us, I know I do, spend most of our day mired in the particular and just struggling to get a broader view and to be able to navigate ourselves according to some kind of design thinking, you know. But it's really hard to do, and I think in many cases, many of the greatest thinkers themselves, had some tremendous personal support that enabled them to ignore the particularities of their surroundings. Maybe Fisher's grandfather was one of those guys. But I really, this is very much the direction Fisher's going in, and he's coming from a place of trying to understand what are people who are already architects or trained to be architects going to do for a living, since architects are undervalued. And I'll rehearse what his arguments are, and losing business and losing a seat at the table. And so the end of my rehearsal of his ideas, or somewhere in the middle, is going to emphasize that his argument is that people trained as architects should see themselves as specialists in this kind of grand thinking, which could contribute to anything, as he says, that has to do with human action or organization. That makes you a pretty valuable person. Not to think of yourself in the narrow sense as somebody whose job it is to think about shapes and forms and buildings. That's a good idea. That's a good argument for the importance of what you're learning and doing, and might do. He characterizes our current world, and these are ideas that are themselves circulating. They're not original ideas. It's an effort to try to understand what's happening. And so he characterizes our current moment as a world of flows. We've been talking about. And he recommends that we think of design as a way of seeing patterns and connections and of integrating discrete activities into larger cycles. So that's broad. That's the kind of broad abstraction and thinking that he's advocating for as a way of understanding what you do as designers or as design thinkers. And those kind of cycles that he imagines could be the cycle of building, an education cycle, an an information cycle flows. So I told him I was coming to this class and that I really didn't have any particular authority for being here, and that Phil always told me I did have something to say, and this got us talking about large cycles going back to like Neolithic age, right? So the way we often think, and I made this comment, I think, in circles that don't think about this, but that the culture and what really affects how we live and what really affects design culture in its small iterations is much bigger than any architect, right? It's modes of, let's call it modes of production or economies. And so, you know, when we were hunters and gatherers, I think we were talking about thousands of years ago, you know. So when we were hunters and gatherers, that would certainly influence design culture. And we were talking about where urban environments would be located. For hunters and gatherers was on top of mountains. Well, when agriculture first began, and that was the 9,000 years ago. So when agriculture is said to have first begun, then it was more significant to situate an urban environment in a valley by a river. This, you know, perception, I would say at the moment, we pretty much know all across the world that we're moving into a new phase. Everyone's trying to figure what is really the new phase and fit it into other thinking about phase shifts. And so, needless to say, this is an amazing opportunity for design thinkers. And so, another idea that Fisher throws out there, I don't know how great it is, but it's not bad, and I think it goes with some of the things that Bree was saying. He proposes, first of all, it's a little subtle shift, but he proposes that we think about design as a performing art rather than as a visual art. And he gives reasons. For one thing, that helps you think that it's collaborative, that you're engaged with something bigger than yourself. It's not an individual artiste production, it's architecture. And the result is an environment that people value, not in terms of looking at it, but how it performs and how important the events that occur in the environment are to them. Instead of thinking of design or architecture in terms of an object or a site to be contemplated in isolation. And one of the things he cites when he makes this point is an often cited book by J.B. Jackson called The Sense of Place, A Sense of Time, which he makes a specific argument about your profession, and he says that, this is a chapter on the redesign of practice, and he says that architects have lost influence and value in the production of the built environment, as the building process has been increasingly managed by other types, like accountants, contractors, and developers, and determined by the prevailing values that their importance to the process represents, like budget and schedule and economies of scale, and by contrast, at the expense of values that have traditionally been favored by architects and designers, such as quality, ethics, aesthetics, time for process, and so on. Another way he talks about is to shift the notion of what the discipline is and does. And a third one he talks about is to regrade, as he calls it, the turf. So again, a sort of expansion or overlap, rather than just seeing oneself as occupying a distinct niche as an architectural firm. But I think his view is broader than those strategies. I don't think he discounts any of those strategies, but in his view, he says again and again that architects should see themselves as design thinkers whose specialty makes them valuable consultants in all forms of human action and organization. What a large way of thinking about what you might contribute, what you might be trained to think about and do. So philosophically, I notice, you'll see when we get there, apparently architects have philosophies. And so he speaks about his philosophy, and philosophically what he thinks architecture should do and be. And this is in a chapter on pragmatism, so you know from the get-go his philosophy is going to be pragmatism. So he argues in this chapter about pragmatism that architects should not pretend that they are ethically neutral, and that ethics is not a matter, is not significant. They should take responsibility for the consequences of their work on the real lives of people. Interestingly enough, in trying to come up with models of pragmatism in architecture, he talks, and this is pretty philosophical still. I don't think maybe elsewhere he explores this further, but he comes up with 3 pre-World War II pragmatic philosophers and matches them with 3 architects whose influence was most felt before World War II. And essentially these are, if you know the pragmatic philosophers, Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Ever heard of any of those? So when he gets to Dewey, he talks, of course, a lot about democracy. So, but he makes these pairings. So we got Peirce and James and Dewey. And then on the architecture side, he pairs them with H.H. Richardson, Henry Hudson Richardson. But it is tremendous to be able to synthesize and use ideas. And I think he does a pretty honest job with it. So Richardson he pairs with Peirce. And Iris, for anybody interested in Peirce, Iris Fisher is actually knows quite a lot about Peirce. And he was one of the people in the U.S. who started the field of semiotics. And he was a pragmatist. So Peirce, and then he pairs William James with Louis Sullivan. And then he pairs John Dewey with Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay, and so what he's trying to point to, the reason he's pointing to pragmatism is that he gets to this point where he says, okay, if architects are always looking on the one hand at the aesthetics of a building and on the other hand at the ethics of the built environment, then this kind of turned into debates about ideals of beauty or ideals of good, you know, utilitarian, and he contrasts utilitarianism with idealism. And so he says, I think we could get beyond the opposition of utilitarianism by thinking about pragmatism, which is the idea that there's really not any ultimate capital G-O-O-D good. There's what's good in a particular time and place in view of our best prediction of its consequences. And so one of the emphases is that we never, and this is something that's always plagued me with regard to action, you know, we're never really going to have enough knowledge